Morning, everyone.
Hello.
Happy Sabbath. Super nice to be here today. Always wonderful to be here on the Sabbath day. Best day of the week. Always look forward to it. When Friday comes around, it's like, yes, finally we get to come here and meet together. So appreciative that everyone is here. It's here today, and I hope to be able to spend some time with you after services. When I ask you to consider great leaders of God that I should say leaders that God has used throughout history, what names and images come into your head? Perhaps you think of Noah, maybe you consider Moses or Elijah. Men with graying hair, maybe bald men, long robes, weathered faces, deep resonant voices, men with years of experience and wisdom. What about today? In this contemporary day and age, what do you think about men with beards, white gray hair, glasses, older men with these stuffy suits, progressive lenses or readers, older ladies with gray hair, very short when they get older, long pantsuits, long dresses dragging the floor? Is that what we think of when we think of great men and women of God? Certainly, many great servants of God that we read about in the Bible were older and even are older today. But that isn't always the case when you study the Bible carefully. You see, God doesn't begin to work with you or call you or use and gifts only when you're considered old. He often begins at a very early age. And many of the greatest servants of God that are highlighted in the Bible are young people in their teens. So in this sermon, I'd like to open your eyes, if I could, to how God uses young people to serve Him in His plan to help serve others, to help others, to save others, and to lead others. It's truly mind-bending. If you've never considered it before, I'd like you to consider it today. So my sermon is entitled, 10 Kids That God Used to Lead His People. 10 kids that God used to lead His people. You're probably familiar with many, if not all of these. But I'd like you to turn with me to Genesis chapter 31 and look at our first youth. First youth in Genesis chapter 37, I should say, Genesis 37. I want to begin with one of the earliest examples of God utilizing a young person to save His people. In Genesis chapter 37, verse 2, it says, "These are the generations of Jacob." Joseph is our first youth. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers, and he was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably to him. So at the age of 17, and, really you could go back and say at birth, obviously, God took a keen interest. God takes a keen interest to at any age. But notice that God took a keen interest in this man, this boy here, in Joseph. But it seems that Joseph had a bit of a problem. Nothing really is negative said of Joseph for the most part in the Bible. I think we can read something here kind of into it. Joseph was somewhat a little bit of a tattletale, it seems. He liked to go to his father, and because he knew his father had this propensity to favor him, and he seemed to play off that a little bit to his gain or to his favor, to get more favor from his father, from his dad. And his brothers didn't take too kindly to it. They didn't like that, and so they contrived a plan to kill him. But at the last minute, thankfully, Reuben, the oldest, said, let's just put him in a pit. And he secretly thought, well, I'll come back and get him out later. But as they were sitting there, they began to think, well, no, maybe Judah said, let's go ahead and sell him to the Midianites. And they would sell him as a slave to Egypt. So they would just pretend to kill him, take his coat of many colors, rub it in the blood of a slaughtered animal, and take it back to their father. And so they decided to do that, and they sold Joseph into slavery to the Midianites, who took him into Egypt. And once he gets to Egypt, in Genesis chapter 39, we read this in verse 1. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, though, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. And so Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. And from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in his house and in his field. And so he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything except the food he ate. So God was working with Joseph, this young man, this older teenager, and he was blessing him. But God was also doing something else. He was purifying Joseph, he was going to, in the fire of trials. Notice in verse 6 again, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me," but he refused. But she wouldn't take no for an answer. She continued to go back at him and back at him. Of the house was there in the house. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me," but he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. But Potiphar's wife used the garment now as false evidence that Joseph was trying to sleep with her. Things didn't look right. And Potiphar then had Joseph put in prison. We don't know how long he was in prison. He was there at least 2 years. Maybe it was 10 years, somewhere in that range. We're not quite sure exactly. But we do know that God continued to bless him and work with Joseph so that when the time was right, Joseph was able to be a useful instrument in the hands of God for a purpose. Notice that purpose in Genesis chapter 45. Genesis chapter 45, we skip all the story of him having a back and forth with his brothers because they don't know who he is, but he knows who his brothers are. And he finally is going to reveal to them who he is. And he says in chapter 45 of Genesis in verse 5, his purpose. "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here," he says to his brothers, "for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you as a remnant on earth and to keep alive you many survivors." Verse 8, "So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all of his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt." And so Joseph was put in second command of the entire kingdom of Egypt. And Joseph essentially ruled Egypt for 80 years. From age 30 to his death at 110, he was in charge. But it was in the heart of a teenager that God placed his word and used him to save his people. Youth number 2 that I want to bring up here. Youth number 2 is Samuel. Samuel. You remember the story of Samuel. Hannah, Samuel's mother, by a miracle was given a child which she named Samuel. She was barren. She didn't have any children. She wanted a child. She went to the temple. She prayed about it, and she finally had a child, Samuel. And she promised then to give him to the Lord. Now, today, maybe I'm getting ahead of the story, but today we might keep a child until they were grown before giving them over in service, if there was a tabernacle today or a temple, before you would give them over in service to God at the temple. We would, well, let's wait till they're maybe a late teenager or something of that nature. But not back then. It was customary to nurse a child back at that time for maybe 3 to 4 years, is most of the sources I've read. 3 to 4 years they would nurse. But this doesn't mean that Samuel was 4 years old when Hannah brought him up for service in the temple. I want to read you something that Benson's commentary writes about this weaning process. Benson's commentary says this: "Not only from the breast, but from the mother's need and care in childish food, She was not bound by the law to go up with her husband, and therefore, though she had been not wont to go, she resolved, as became a prudent woman, to stay at home till the child was so far grown up as not only to be strong enough to accompany her, but capable of being instructed in the service of the tabernacle and of being useful therein. So it's important that you don't bring a 4-year-old child to the temple to be babysat, because that's probably what would have happened if he was very, very young at that young age. It's interesting to note that in 1 Samuel 1:28, and I'll just reference this, but you can start turning to 1 Samuel 3 if you'd like. But the text states that he worshiped the Lord. Now, I don't think we're dealing with a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old. It's a little bit iffy. They worship the Lord. That's a little bit of a stretch, I think. It is possible we could be looking at somebody along the age of 10 to 12 years old, though. That would seem consistent. One who would be old enough to worship the Lord and able to be instructed as a helpful servant. So as we come to 1 Samuel 3, we get an intimate look at the calling of young Samuel. Josephus says that he was 11. So it's possible he was 11, 12, 13, somewhere in that range when he received the call from God. 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 1. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. And at that time Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. And the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. And then the Lord called Samuel and said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I didn't call you. Go lie down again." And so he went back and he laid down. And the Lord called again, "Samuel." And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I didn't call you, my son. Go lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know that the word of the Lord, had not yet been revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel again the third time. And he arose and he went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." And then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down. If he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" And so Samuel went and he lay down in his place, and the Lord came and stood, calling as at other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant hears." And then the Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel, at which the 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle." Verse 19, and Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. Notice that God didn't give him instructions until Samuel answered. He had to answer the call, even at that young age, so that God could use him. And we know the story that Samuel served the Lord as a judge of Israel for 40 years. We know that he anointed Saul and David as kings over Israel, and he had a profound influence on King David, which is our next youth. Youth number 3 is David. 1 Samuel 16, if you'd like to turn there. David was but a youth when Samuel came to anoint him king over Israel. Let's read about that here in 1 Samuel chapter 16. Many people think David was right around 15 years old when Samuel came to anoint David. So a 15-year-old here, the youngest of the children, out in the field, and here comes Samuel, and he's asking for the children of Jesse because God told him to go there and to anoint the next king of Israel. And so here he is in 1 Samuel 16 and verse 6, and we come to the first and the oldest boy of Jesse. And it says, when they came, he looked on Eliab, and he thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For, notice this, the Lord sees not as man sees, Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And so he saw the heart of David at 15, and he said, this is a man that I can work with. Verse 10, and Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. And then Samuel said to Jesse, are these all of your sons? And he said, well, there remains yet the youngest, and behold, he's taking care of the sheep in the field. And Samuel said to Jesse, well, go send for him, and we will sit down until he comes. And he sent for him and brought him in. And now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. And then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. So this was a preparatory move where David was commissioned to be king over Israel. He wasn't king for a number of years. He took the throne when he was 30. So it was a number of years, but God was preparing him. God didn't have to come to David through Samuel at this time. He didn't have to do it when he was 15. He could have waited. He could have waited a long time. He could have waited for several years, but God chose to make known to David at the tender age of 15 that he had a plan for David and that he was going to be with him as David grew older. But even though that he wasn't king, David had a heart for God at that young age and a strong desire to serve him, and that's why we see him shortly after this anointing taking on Goliath in that famous story at the battle in the Valley of Elah, and defending the name of the Lord with vigor. The key to David, however, was the fact that he had a heart for service to God. Notice how David is described in Acts chapter 13. If you want to turn to Acts chapter 13, here we see there's a description of David, which we're familiar with, which we actually sort of read here. But Acts chapter 13, verse 22, it says, and when he had removed him, that is Saul, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David the son of Jesse a man after my own heart. So David was a man after God's heart. This wasn't years later. This was in his teens. His teens. He was a man after God's own heart. Samuel told Saul in 1 Samuel 13 that he had rejected, God had rejected Saul from being king. And God was seeking someone after his own heart. And Samuel learned this from God in 1 Samuel 3 that we just read. When Eliab was rejected as being king, he said, I'm not looking for outward appearance, I'm looking for inward. I want to know what's going on the inside. But notice what makes him, brethren, a man after God's own heart. Verse 22 continues, who will do all my will. That is the person that David was as a boy and continued to be as a man. You're never too young to do the will of the Lord. Youth number 4. Youth number 4 is Josiah. I'd like you to turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 34. In 2 Chronicles 34, we have an overview of a young boy who chose to do the right thing during his reign in seeking God. It's always been a very remarkable verse to me as growing up as a boy, looking at this as an example. 2 Chronicles chapter 34, we see here in verse 1 how old Josiah was. Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign. And he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. And notice what it says in verse 2. He did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. And he walked in the ways of David his father, and he did not turn aside to the right or to the left hand. Now, this has always been, as I said, one of the most remarkable scriptures in the Bible to me. That Josiah was 8 years old, and he did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. You know, we talk about age of accountability, and I think in the Jewish culture, age of accountability is something like 16, something close to that. But we might go to this scripture here and say, what was going on here? How accountable was he? Now, there is a caveat. He likely had a co-regent. He had somebody who supported him. He had somebody who cared for him as he was ruler. He didn't have carte blanche. He wasn't one of these wild kings as a 5 or 6 or 7 year old. 8 year old. He had somebody that was helping him out make decisions. But it doesn't say that he took him down the path of his father, Ammon. Notice how old he was when he began to really seek God, though, and what he did with that knowledge. 2 Chronicles 34 and verse 3. And in the 8th year of his reign, so here we now have a 15-year-old boy, maybe 16-year-old boy, depending on how we're counting the ages in Jewish numerology. But he was still a boy, a teenager. And he began to seek the God of David his father. And it says in the 12th year, so about 19 years old, maybe 20, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the Asherim, and the carved and metal images. All the pagan idols he wiped out of the land. And it took him about 6 years to wipe out as much as he could to cleanse the land of this idolatry. And then he began to restore the temple. And when they began restoring it, they found the book of the law, and revival hit the land of Judah. It was a wonderful time, and they had the great Passover that year. And this teenager, king, led God's people into a revival for a period of time he became one of the greatest kings of Judah. He and another teenager who was called in the 13th year of Josiah's reign did great and godly things in Israel. That's our next youth. Our next youth is, number 5, is Jeremiah. Jeremiah. Imagine you're 17 years old. Take yourself back to that age, if you would. And you hear a call from God. And he is clearly speaking to you. There's no doubt about it. What do you imagine he would say to you? Look at Jeremiah chapter 1. Jeremiah chapter 1. So Jeremiah is traditionally thought to be about a 17-year-old teenager when God spoke to him. And Jeremiah was scared. Who wouldn't be scared if you heard the voice of the Lord talking to you? Wait a second, what's going on? And I really suppose most of us would be at this age. Jeremiah 1 verse 4. Now the word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. And then I, that is Jeremiah, said, Ah, Lord God, behold, I don't know how to speak, for I'm only a youth. I'm only a youth. Don't say I'm only a youth. The Lord said to me, do not say I'm only a youth. For to all to whom I send you, you shall go, and whatever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. And then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, behold, I have put my words in your mouth. See, I have set you this day over nations, over kingdoms, to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. He said this to a 17-year-old boy. This is what you're going to do. Little did Jeremiah know at the time all that entailed. But he would eventually save the throne of David by bringing the princess Tehaphnehes, the daughter of Zedekiah, to Ireland, escaping the Babylonian siege at that time or later on. And this act would help to heal the breach of Pharez and Zerah. Tia was the descendant of Pharez, and King Haramon of Ireland was the descendant of Zerah. And this would preserve the throne of David in the British Isles to await the return of Jesus Christ to sit on that throne. This is what Jeremiah did. God would do great things through Jeremiah and use him during the reign of 5 or possibly 6 kings. Some of them were very, very short-lived, but he worked with him during this whole period of time. But God had work for him to do at a young age. And he said in verse 17, he said, it's time to work. It's time to get to work. But you, he said, dress yourself for work, arise, and say to them everything that I command you, but don't be dismayed by them, lest I dismay you before them. And I behold, I make you this day a fortified city, an iron pillar and a bronze wall against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the people of the land. And they will fight against you, How would you like to hear that as a 17-year-old? They're going to fight against you. But God comforts him. He said, they shall not prevail against you, for I am with you, declares the Lord, to deliver you. So God gave this young man a task to perform, and he did it very admirably for about 40 years. And he helped Josiah in his efforts to reform the nation of Judah and turn them back to God. But it all began as a teenager. Youth number 6. Youth number 6 is Daniel. Daniel. And we could say in parentheses, his friends. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The youth Daniel comes onto the scene in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim's reign. I'd like you to turn to Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1. It was at this time that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was invading the Levant, and he took Jerusalem. Many scholars believe that Daniel was maybe 15 to 19 years old, somewhere in that range. And the three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were possibly just a little bit younger. But at any rate, we have a teen band here who were taken, which wasn't uncommon at the time. One of the terms of surrender was to give up vessels from the temple, to give up royalty, captive slaves, so to sort of make this peace. And that's what happened during this deportation. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house. And he brought them to the land of Shinar and the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. And then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So Daniel was of nobility, and as such, likely was influenced personally by King Josiah, who was just shortly before killed by Pharaoh Necho of Egypt as he was going up to meet him, as Pharaoh was going to meet Nebuchadnezzar at the Battle of Carchemish. Jeremiah the prophet in Judah at the same time also must have had a great influence on Daniel, I believe. So Daniel here is somewhere between 15 and 19, this teenager, and he was taken to Babylon and placed for training in the royal courts of Babylon. And God worked with this teen in a very special way. I want you to notice verse 8. But Daniel resolved, it says, that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. You see, God was sure to provide what was needed to Daniel to perform the task of serving him. You know, there were many tests, there were many trials that Daniel underwent as he grew older, even at an old age, thrown into the lion's den. But in many ways, out of all the tests that Daniel underwent, it was the first one that set the tone for Daniel and his friends, because it says they had purposed in their heart at a very young age to not defile themselves. So from a teenager, God grew Daniel, and eventually he brought him to the 3rd highest ruler in the entire kingdom of Babylon, and one of the 3 highest officials in the kingdom of the Persians. Daniel's life spanned the entire captivity, and Daniel became a symbol, as it were, throughout the 70-year captivity that God would not forsake his people and would honor his promise of saving them and bring them back to the land of Israel, which he eventually did with the Cyrus decree. Youth number 7. Youth number 7 is Esther. Esther. This is the first girl that appears on this list. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah. Her Persian name was Esther. You can turn to Esther chapter 2. Esther chapter 2, but you will remember leading up to this chapter in Esther chapter 2, the king of Persia, Xerxes, deposed his current wife Vashti because she refused to come to the banquet, as it says, to show off her beauty. She was one of the earliest women's libbers, I guess. She didn't want to do it, and she refused to do it, and so this was unheard of, and so she was vanquished. She was taken from the throne. And so now Xerxes has no queen. And so we pick up the story after this happened in chapter 2 and verse 1. And it says, sometime later, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, we don't know how much longer this was or later, but it says he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And then the king's attendants proposed, well, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Now, let me interject here that the Midrash states that Esther was 80 when she married King Xerxes. That is utterly ridiculous. It's absurd. She was not 80. The text states that they would be young virgins. Beautiful young virgins. That's not to take any away from 80-year-old, but there's a difference. Beautiful young virgins. Now, according to how marriages were done at that time, Esther would have almost certainly been a teenager. There's almost no question about this. And likely, she might have been a young teenager at that. Maybe along the lines of 13 to 16. Some sources believe she was as young as 12. Now, there are different reasons for why we believe this, and we can talk about that later because we don't really have time to go into it. But it wasn't that uncommon, let's say, for this to happen at teenage years. And we're going to get into this a little bit later. But I want you to look at verse 3 here, because it continues. It says, and let the king appoint commissioners to each province of his kingdom to assemble all the beautiful young virgins into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch in charge of the women, and let them be given beauty treatments. And then let the young woman who pleases the king become queen in place of Vashti. This suggestion pleased the king, and he acted accordingly. And so you see that she was taken, she was put into the harem, I should say, and she went through this beautification treatment. Verse 7, Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, because she did not have a father or mother. And the young woman was lovely in form and appearance. And when her father and mother had died, Mordecai had taken her in as his own daughter. And when the king's command and edict had been proclaimed, many young women gathered at the citadel under Susa under the care of Hegai. Esther was also taken to the palace and placed under the care of Hegai, the custodian of women. And the young woman pleased him and favored him, and so he quickly provided her with beauty treatments and the specialized diet. And he assigned her 7 select maidservants from the palace and transferred her with them to the best place in the harem. God was showing favor, believe it or not, to Esther. So we know that the virgins were apparently in the harem for a period of time. We don't know how long, maybe a year or two before being called up by King Xerxes. But eventually she was called up, and we know that she became queen. So when Esther became queen, she might have been somewhere between 15 years old to 18 years old, somewhere in that range. And we learn later in the story that a tremendous weight is placed upon her shoulders, upon this teenager, as she uncovers a plot by Haman to kill all the Jews in the kingdom. But with Mordecai's encouragement and the fasting of the Jews for her, she comes before the king without being called in order to expose the plot to wipe out the Jews. Now, at that time, you couldn't come before the king unless you were called. And if he didn't reach out his scepter to let you touch it, you could be killed. Esther put her life at risk to try and save her people. A teenage queen was used by God to save his people. It was an act that, if she refused, would bring about the destruction of the Jews, which means the Savior of the world would not have been born. So as a teenager, you never know if you're called for such a time as this. God can use you for great things when you yield your life to Him. Youth number 8. Youth number 8, we come to the New Testament to another woman, Mary. I'd like you to turn to Luke chapter 1. Mary, the mother of Jesus. Luke chapter 1, and I want to read through this section here where Gabriel, the angel, comes and speaks with Mary. Luke chapter 1, and look at verse 26. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. And he came to her and he said, "Greetings, O favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was greatly troubled at the saying and tried to discern what sort of greeting this might be. And the angel said to her, "Don't be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. And he will be great, and you will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." Wow, that's something else to hear that. And so Mary said to the angel, well, the first thing into her mind, how is this going to be? I'm a virgin. How am I going to have a child? And the angel answered to her, and he said, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. And behold, your relative Elizabeth, in her old age, has also conceived a son, and this is the 6th month with her, who was called barren. For nothing will be impossible with God." And Mary said, "Behold," what did she say? She said, "I am your servant. Let it be to me according to your word." And the angel departed from her. Let me just say a word here on marriage at this point. To consider the age of Mary. Several sources indicate that marriage at a young age at that time was a societal norm. So it would not be terribly uncommon for girls to become betrothed as young as 14 and possibly even younger. If Mary was typical of the time, she would have been taught domestic duties in order to prepare for marriage. I mean, that was the goal of women. It wasn't to go out and get a career. It wasn't to, become a doctor, a lawyer, or, a physician, or any of the things that they wanted men to do. It wasn't to be a leader in the community as far as, sitting in as the elders of the gates. That wasn't it at all. The job of a woman at the time was to learn how to run a household, how to take care of a family, how to take care of a husband, how to take care of children. That was it. And so the Jews then, and even today, primary purpose and goal is to have children. That's what they want, because God knows they know that God wants godly offspring. That's the goal. So I don't know if there was a formal schooling at this time for girls. At this time. We know that there was at least later. But we know in general that Jews saw the purpose of marriage to have children. So there wouldn't be any waiting around until 19 or 20. That would be kind of pointless to get married. I remember Mrs. Meeker one time saying, she said when she was, 18, she didn't have any prospects, and she thought, I'm going to be a spinster, an old spinster. And she was like 18. It's incredible. They didn't wait around unless there was just not a match they couldn't find. Even in today's culture, it's not terribly uncommon for a woman to marry at 18. How many of you were married at 18 or 19? Yeah, young. So even today, so back then you can imagine what it would be. Even 100 years ago here, 15 wasn't terribly uncommon. My grandmother was 16 when she got married. So imagine an angel coming to a 14, a 15, a 16-year-old, whatever she was definitely young, and being told that they will become pregnant with the Messiah. This teenager took on being a servant for God and said, "Let it be according to your word." And when God needed her, she said, "Yes, yes, I will do it." And she fulfilled her duty at a young age, and then went on to have, we think, at least 6 more children. Youth number 9. Youth number 9 is actually a conglomeration. It is the disciples the disciples. I'd like you to turn to Matthew chapter 4. Just want to read just one small section and then a short discussion about why I believe the disciples were teenagers, or at least a good chunk of them. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 18. Now let's read down to verse 22. As he walked by the sea, that is Jesus, of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And immediately he left their nets, and he followed him. And going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending nets, and he called them. And immediately they left their boat and their father, and he followed them. I think too often we tend to think of the disciples as these middle-aged men that left their lucrative careers behind to follow Jesus. And while it's certainly possible that some of them might have been a little bit older, this is typically not how it worked at that time. You see, children would begin their education at the age of 4 to 5 in a school called Beit Sefer. And that would be considered a primary education or elementary school for us today. And then around 12 to 13 years old, the best students would continue on to Beit Midrash, where they would learn a trade at the same time. My grandfather, I think, only went through 5 grades because he went to work in the fields. That's what they did back in the 20s and the 30s. My grandmother went through 8 grades. That was the education. She prepared for having a life as a family, a married woman. But by the time these men, or these boys, would turn to about 18 or 19, they would go into a trade full time. And if they didn't, the best of the best would go on to follow a rabbi. And this is where discipleship comes in. So when Jesus comes to these young men, he is inviting them to learn from him the way that others would follow and learn from other itinerant rabbis. James and John, we see, were working with their father. Now, maybe they were learning a craft still. Maybe they were starting their craft. We don't exactly know. We know that they were working with their father to do this. Peter and James may have done the same thing. But wait, you say, well, Peter was married, wasn't he? So he must have been quite a bit older. Well, not necessarily, because it wasn't terribly uncommon for boys to marry at age 18 or 19 in those days. The idea was it's better to marry than to burn with lust. So it would save a lot of problems if they would just get married. So these matches happened fairly early on. So they would be set in their career too. Also think about that. By 18 to 19 years old, they're not going to college. They had their career set. They could get married. It wouldn't be a problem. And most of the time, they would live with the parents maybe for a year or two before they would actually go out on their own. So while it isn't a certainty that all the disciples were teenagers, I believe that it was highly likely that several of them were. And God used these teenagers to eventually do very great and magnificent things. Number 10, youth number 10. I'd like you to turn to John chapter 6. Number 10. This is a very obscure youth who did something, I think, pretty amazing in John chapter 6. John chapter 6, we have the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And you recall the story, no doubt, but do you remember where the bread and the fish came from? Let's read this in John chapter 6. John chapter 6 and verse 1, after this Jesus crossed to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd followed him because he saw the signs he was performing on the sick. And then Jesus went up to the mountains and he sat down with his disciples. And the Jewish feast of the Passover was near. And when Jesus looked up and he saw this large crowd coming toward him, 5,000 men. So we don't know if this was 15,000 if you count women and children, 20,000, we're not really sure, but it was a large, very large crowd. And he said to Philip, where can we buy food or bread for these people to eat? But he was asking this to test him, for he knew what he was about to do. And Philip answered, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to have a small piece. And one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, here's a boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. Youth number 10 is a boy and his lunch. A boy and his lunch. What difference will this make among so many, he said. It's a simple detail that's easy to miss because it's too often we tend to overlook children. Whether they're little ones or whether they're teenagers, they should be seen and not heard is the same. But God made a point of making sure that we knew, that you knew, that I knew what happened back then. That it was a boy who owned those 5 loaves and 2 fish. A little boy had it. This boy could have declined. He could have said, there's not enough for me and everyone else. This is my fish. This is my bread. Why would I give it up? I wouldn't get any of it anyway. They'll eat all my food. There won't be enough left. But he didn't do that. He was willing to give up everything that he had. And Jesus took the boy's offering and he fed not just 5,000, but he had fed way many more than that. What an act of service from this boy. Just a little detail, but a big action. I think there's a couple lessons that we can learn, a couple things I just want to tell you here as we close about all of these examples. First, realize that God can do great things with young people. Even though our brains aren't fully mature until age 30, young kids and teenagers are not put outside the camp. They are and they should be an integral part of the believer's community. They can offer a great amount of value and even have a strong and powerful drive to serve God. Sometimes it's more powerful when they're younger than when you get older. Secondly, young people that are used by God must know that in order to be used by God, they have to yield themselves and they have to be teachable. In each of the 10 youths presented here, none of them gloried in themselves. Not a single one. They yielded their will to God and allowed Him to use them for His benefit. That's what made them great. That's why their stories are recorded here. Impact on the lives of others. What they did was use the talents that God gave them and allowed Him to use them in a variety of ways to further His plan. And thirdly, it's never too young to place your trust and faith in the Lord. You're never too young to place your faith and trust in the Lord. These young men and women trusted in God, and they trusted in His plan even when times were tough. And times were tough for these kids. They were really tough. When they had their backs against the wall, they were still concerned about others, we see in their stories, especially His people, and they stood against the forces of this world and on the side of God without compromise to win the day. So when you begin to put a list together of the greatest servants of God, just realize that many of them began to be used by God as teenagers. And as for you teenagers that hear this message, I want you to know that God has great plans for you and will use you, yes, you, to do great things for Him if you let Him. If you let Him. So as the psalmist said, out of the mouth of babes and infants you have established strength, and as Isaiah the prophet wrote, a little child shall lead them.